In a single moment at Logan International Airport, the system designed to protect Americans became the very thing that threatened one woman's dignity, all because of the color of her skin. Chief Justice Gabrielle Mitchell was no ordinary traveler. She was one of the highest-ranking legal authorities in the nation. But dressed like any other business-class passenger, she became a target not for what she did, but for how she looked. What followed was not just one woman's fight for dignity, but a national reckoning that would shake the foundations of law enforcement and expose the raw truth of racial bias in America. The doors of the airport precinct swung open with a harsh metallic clunk. Chief Justice Gabrielle Mitchell emerged, her wrists still marked red from the handcuffs that had bound her. Her tailored blazer hung slightly off-center, the result of forceful restraint she'd just endured. Camera flashes erupted like a storm, microphones thrust toward her face, reporters calling out questions that crashed into one another like waves. "Justice Mitchell, were you assaulted? Are you filing federal charges? Did they know who you were?" She didn't speak. Her expression remained firm, unreadable. She pulled the sleeve of her blazer down gently, covering the irritated skin. Behind her, just beyond the glass doors, two officers stood frozen in disbelief. Officer James Barrett looked like he'd seen a ghost. Officer Ryan Collins couldn't lift his eyes from the floor. They thought they could silence her. Instead, they had handed her the power to end their careers. 48 hours earlier, Logan International Airport had been its usual chaos. Flights delayed, announcements echoing in sterile English, travelers dragging luggage with hurried steps. The terminal hummed with impatience. At Gate B10, passengers waited to board Flight 672 to Chicago. Chief Justice Gabrielle Mitchell stood alone at the front of the business class line. To most, she was just another high-level professional heading home. Her slate-gray suit was crisp, her posture composed, her face calm. She clutched a leather-bound portfolio and a boarding pass tucked into her passport. A direct flight, a quiet seat, and 3 days of court prep ahead. Routine. Except one woman didn't see routine. She saw offense. Elizabeth Whitley, seated across from the line, glared at Gabrielle as though her presence were some sort of provocation. Elizabeth was in her mid-60s, dressed head to toe in designer brands, her gold bangles clinking every time she shifted. With exaggerated sighs, her expression tight-lipped and superior, she spoke volumes. "She doesn't belong there," she muttered loudly to no one in particular. "Unbelievable what they allow these days." Gabrielle heard it but didn't react. This wasn't new, these looks, the subtle barbs, the side eyes. She'd faced them in courtrooms, at law conferences, on Capitol Hill. Still, she stayed focused, scrolling through her tablet, rereading briefs on upcoming appellate cases. But Elizabeth wasn't done. With the self-righteous energy of someone convinced she was protecting something sacred, she marched up to the gate agent. "Excuse me," she said with faux urgency. "That woman right there?" "Yes. She's been staring at my bags. Something's off. I don't feel safe getting on this flight with her." The agent blinked. "Ma'am, she's in the business class line and has already checked in." "Doesn't matter," Elizabeth cut in. "You need to check her credentials. I've traveled enough to know when something isn't right." The gate agent tried to de-escalate. "Ma'am, she went through the proper screening. Maybe she used someone else's pass. Maybe it's fake. Look at her. You should call security." And just like that, a false sense of danger was planted. Within minutes, 2 uniformed officers, Barrett and Collins, walked into the scene. Both men were already on edge, a long day, a crowded terminal, and now a concerned white woman making claims of suspicious behavior. Their default setting: control. Elizabeth turned up the drama as soon as she saw them. "Officers, thank God. I don't feel safe near that woman. She's acting strange, watching me, watching my luggage. I don't know what she's planning." Barrett narrowed his eyes in Gabrielle's direction. Collins cracked his knuckles. "Ma'am," Barrett said as they approached Gabrielle, "step out of the line, please. We need to ask you a few questions." Gabrielle looked up slowly from her tablet. Her eyes moved from Barrett to Collins, then briefly to Elizabeth, who stood off to the side with a smug tilt of her chin. "What is this about?" Gabrielle asked evenly. "We received a complaint," Collins said. "You've been making another passenger uncomfortable." Gabrielle blinked once, calmly. "By standing in line? We just need to verify your credentials. Step aside." There was no point in resisting. Gabrielle stepped forward, away from the line. Collins's posture was aggressive from the start. "Name, ID, boarding pass." Gabrielle pulled them from her purse, handed them over without hesitation. Barrett glanced at the document. "Gabrielle Mitchell," he read aloud. "Business class, huh?" His tone carried judgment he didn't bother to hide. "What do you do for a living?" he asked. Gabrielle met his gaze. "I uphold justice." Barrett raised an eyebrow. "Is that right?" She didn't flinch. "You'll find out soon enough." At that moment, the air shifted. Elizabeth whispered to a nearby traveler, clearly enjoying the scene she'd created. Collins leaned in closer to Gabrielle, his voice lower and colder. "Why all the questions? You acting nervous about something?" Gabrielle's voice stayed steady. "I'm asserting my civil rights, something you've sworn to protect." Collins laughed once, sharp. "You think you're smarter than us, huh?" Gabrielle looked between the two of them. "I want your badge numbers." The words sliced through the noise of the terminal like a siren. The officers stiffened. Passengers began to take notice. A few pulled out phones. One person began recording. That was the moment the temperature shifted. The eyes turned sharper. The stares turned to whispers. And it all began with Elizabeth's gaze. That first spark of quiet contempt that would soon become an inferno. Elizabeth Whitley had traveled in luxury her entire life. She preferred first class over business, private terminals over public gates. Her voice, refined and rehearsed, rarely heard the word no. She was used to being catered to, nodded at, taken seriously on sight. But today, something disturbed her balance, a black woman standing calmly in the business class line. To Elizabeth, this wasn't just inconvenient. It was offensive. Chief Justice Gabrielle Mitchell stood with a tablet in hand, professionally dressed, exuding self-assurance. She didn't speak to anyone. She didn't fidget. She looked entirely at ease. And that was the problem. Elizabeth sat nearby, gripping the handle of her designer suitcase, her face twisted with disdain as she watched Gabrielle check her flight time. A scoff escaped her lips. She leaned to the man beside her, stranger or not, and muttered, "What are we letting through these lines now? It's ridiculous." The man shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Elizabeth's voice rose. "That one's in business class." "I doubt it." A gate attendant behind the counter glanced over but remained silent. Elizabeth stood, her bracelets jangling like wind chimes, and stepped closer to the gate desk. Her heels clicked with exaggerated purpose. She didn't look around to gauge others' reactions. She assumed they agreed. "Excuse me," she said, her tone laced with fake politeness. "I have a concern." The young woman at the counter smiled. "Yes, ma'am." "That woman in the line," Elizabeth pointed without hesitation. "The one in the gray suit. She's been shifting around, looking at people's luggage. I don't feel comfortable boarding the plane with someone behaving that way." The agent blinked, caught off guard. "Ma'am," she checked in normally and passed through all security measures. Elizabeth didn't back down. "That's not the point. She's acting strange. Something about her seems off." The agent glanced toward Gabrielle, who remained unaware of the exchange. "She hasn't done anything that violates airport policy." Elizabeth leaned in, dropping her voice but not her intensity. "Do you know how easy it is to fake documents these days? People print boarding passes all the time. You have no idea who she is." The agent hesitated. Elizabeth pressed harder. I'm telling you this because I care about safety. If she isn't who she says she is, or if she's using someone else's ID, that's on you. I'm asking you to verify her identity. It's a basic security measure." There was a beat of uncertainty. The agent nodded slightly, unsure of what else to do. Elizabeth smiled, satisfied. She turned away, but not before adding loudly enough for others to hear. "Honestly, I don't feel safe flying with her. Someone needs to do something before it's too late." The words hung in the air like a threat. Several passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably. Some stared at Gabrielle, others looked away. The agent picked up a small radio behind the desk. Her voice was quiet but urgent. Within moments, she had relayed Elizabeth's complaint to airport security. Elizabeth returned to her seat, a smug grin tugging at the corner of her mouth. She crossed her legs and sipped from a bottle of imported water. She didn't need to check whether her message had taken effect. She knew it would. She watched Gabrielle with calculated detachment. Gabrielle hadn't even glanced in her direction. She remained focused on her tablet, unaware of the accusation now circulating behind her back. Another passenger, middle-aged, glasses, holding a briefcase, turned to Elizabeth. "Excuse me," he said, hesitant. "Do you really think she's a threat?" Elizabeth didn't hesitate. "Absolutely. You can't be too careful nowadays. I trust my instincts." The man nodded but said nothing more. Elizabeth saw his uncertainty and relished it. The gate agent tried to remain composed, but her eyes kept darting toward the business class line. A ripple of tension ran through the area. It wasn't loud, it wasn't chaotic, but it was enough to shift the energy in the terminal. Elizabeth had done this before, subtle, persuasive, always stopping just short of being overtly hateful. She'd mastered the performance. She wasn't yelling or calling names. She was concerned. She was reasonable. She was, in her own eyes, the voice of order in a world slipping into chaos. And now the next step was unfolding right on cue. A low crackle came from the gate agent's earpiece. She looked up, nodded quickly, and set the radio down. Her eyes went briefly to Gabrielle. She took a small step back from the counter, as if preparing for something unpleasant. Elizabeth didn't bother hiding her satisfaction. She tilted her head slightly, watching the far end of the terminal. From a security corridor, two uniformed airport police officers emerged. Officer Barrett and Officer Collins walked with intention, their expressions flat and focused. They weren't running, there was no urgency, but their presence was enough to shift the attention of several nearby travelers. Passengers stepped aside. Phones rose discreetly. Someone began recording. The officers didn't ask questions at the counter. They didn't stop to verify the nature of the complaint. They didn't even glance at the security feed. The call had come from a white woman in expensive clothes using words like uncomfortable and suspicious. That was enough. Barrett looked ahead, eyes narrowing as he scanned the line. Collins cracked his neck and adjusted his belt. The airspace quickened. Officer James Barrett approached with the confidence of someone who had never been challenged. His walk was deliberate, posture upright, a man used to being obeyed. 30 years in uniform had taught him how to size people up fast, at least that's what he believed. He prided himself on reading a room, reading a face, and reading between lines that weren't even there. Beside him, Officer Ryan Collins moved with a different kind of energy, tight, forceful, impulsive. His eyes locked on Gabrielle with immediate suspicion. There was no conversation between the two officers. They didn't need it. Their roles were understood. Gabrielle Mitchell remained exactly where she was, quiet, composed, her attention seemingly still on the tablet in her hand. She looked up as the officers neared but didn't move. Barrett spoke first, voice clipped and official. "Ma'am, we need to speak with you." She raised an eyebrow slightly. "Is there an issue?" "Step out of the line," Collins added, already stepping into her personal space. Gabrielle slipped her tablet into her leather bag and stood upright, adjusting the strap on her shoulder with measured calm. Of course. Barrett gestured for her to move to the side of the boarding line. Gabrielle complied without protest. Her heels tapped lightly against the tiled floor as she followed. Passengers nearby looked on silently. Some whispered. A few began filming discreetly, unsure of what was happening but sensing something off in the officer's posture. Too aggressive, too eager. Once she was out of the line, Collins squared up to her. "Name?" he asked bluntly. Gabrielle reached into her handbag, pulled out her driver's license and boarding pass, and handed them over without hesitation. Her fingers didn't shake. Her expression didn't shift. Barrett took the documents and gave them a quick once-over. "Gabrielle Mitchell," he read slowly. "Business class." He said it like it was a question, like it didn't make sense. Gabrielle didn't blink. "What brings you to Boston?" Barrett asked. Her eyebrows danced, and she answered. "What do you do for a living?" Gabrielle looked him straight in the eye. "I uphold justice." The pause after her words wasn't long, but it was dense. Barrett cocked his head as if trying to decode her tone. Collins smirked. "That's supposed to mean something?" he asked, tone half sarcastic. "It means I work in law," she said, flat but firm. Collins crossed his arms. "You a lawyer or something?" Gabrielle didn't answer immediately. She watched them both as if measuring how much they actually wanted to know and how much they could handle if they did. "I'm not obligated to share personal employment details without probable cause," she replied calmly. Barrett raised a brow. "We're asking because of a security complaint." Gabrielle gave a small nod. "Then I assume you have reason to suspect I've committed a crime?" Neither officer answered that. Barrett looked back down at her ID, then up at her again, as if still processing something that didn't quite compute. Collins stared harder now, irritated by her composure. "Are these your real documents?" Collins asked suddenly. Gabrielle's jaw tensed just slightly, but her tone stayed steady. "Are you questioning the legitimacy of my federal-issued identification?" "I'm questioning your attitude," Collins snapped. Gabrielle took a quiet breath. "Is there a specific statute or protocol that allows you to detain or question me based solely on someone feeling uncomfortable with my presence in a boarding line?" Barrett shifted, suddenly uncomfortable. Collins didn't flinch. "You're not being detained. Then I'm free to board my flight?" "Not until we clear this up," he said. Gabrielle folded her arms across her chest, not defiant but firm. "And what exactly needs clearing up?" "My ticket is valid, my ID is authentic, I have not breached any airport security policies." Collins stepped closer. "You're being difficult." "I'm being precise," she corrected. Barrett cut in, trying to regain control. "Look, just answer the questions, and we'll be done here." "I've answered everything that's required by law," Gabrielle said. "Beyond that, I'm under no obligation to indulge suspicion that's rooted in bias." Barrett frowned. "We're not biased." She tilted her head slightly. "Then perhaps you'd like to explain why you approached me without first reviewing surveillance footage or consulting with the reporting party to verify details?" Barrett didn't respond. Gabrielle continued, voice low but razor-sharp. "Because from where I stand, it looks like you acted on one person's word without corroborating evidence. One person's fear. One person's prejudice." Collins bristled. "You think we'd waste time over someone's feelings?" "I think that's exactly what's happening," Gabrielle replied. Barrett handed back her license and boarding pass, but his face showed irritation. "Next time, don't act so confrontational." Gabrielle slipped the items back into her purse. "I wasn't confrontational. I was asserting my rights." The tension between them simmered. Collins was visibly restraining himself from snapping. Barrett kept glancing around, noting the phones aimed in their direction. Gabrielle stood in place. She made no move to walk away, waiting instead for the situation to resolve itself lawfully. Barrett opened his mouth, but Gabrielle spoke first. "May I ask for your names and badge numbers for my records?" Barrett hesitated. Collins looked like he'd been slapped. "You're kidding, right?" Collins said. "It's a lawful request," Gabrielle replied. Barrett hesitated again, then answered. "Barrett, 6482. Collins didn't respond. Gabrielle kept her voice even. "And yours, officer? Why do you need that?" Collins shot back. Gabrielle didn't blink. "Because I believe you've already crossed several lines of protocol, and if this interaction continues the way it has, I may need to report misconduct." Barrett looked at Collins, suddenly unsure of what to say. Officer Barrett had hesitated before giving his badge number. Collins, however, remained motionless, jaw set tight, his eyes sharp with irritation. He didn't like being challenged, especially not by someone who stayed calm when he was clearly trying to provoke. Gabrielle stood poised. She wasn't aggressive. She didn't raise her voice. But her presence was cutting through the air like a scalpel. Controlled, specific, exacting. "I'll need your badge number as well," she said again, eyes on Collins. Collins stepped forward. "You think you can demand things from me?" "I'm exercising my rights under U.S. civil law," Gabrielle replied, "specifically Title 42, Section 1983. I have the right to request identification from any officer engaged in a public interaction, especially one that may be unlawful or discriminatory." Barrett's mouth tightened. He knew that reference. Most officers did. Civil rights violations were serious business, and most of them started with the wrong kind of stop or the wrong kind of ego. Collins didn't back down. "You think you're in some kind of courtroom? You're not." Gabrielle didn't flinch. "No, but you're acting like this airport is your private domain." The pause was suffocating. Travelers nearby could sense the tension. Phones were out, recording. Lights were on. A low hum of murmurs spread through the gate area like static electricity before a storm. Barrett took half a step back, scanning the faces forming a quiet audience. Gabrielle continued. "I was approached without probable cause. I was not observed engaging in any illegal behavior. The sole justification for this stop appears to be the subjective discomfort of another passenger." "You don't know what was reported," Collins snapped. "Then you can clarify it," Gabrielle answered. "I'm open to hearing what specifically I've done that prompted this." Collins's lips curled. "You think you're clever." "I think I'm educated," Gabrielle replied coolly, "and aware of what law enforcement is and is not permitted to do." Barrett shifted uneasily again. He'd seen these situations before, not exactly like this, but close enough. An encounter begins simple. Someone gets defensive. Someone else pushes. Then it escalates. Collins wasn't reading the warning signs. His jaw clenched tighter. His right hand hovered near the cuff pouch at his belt. Gabrielle saw it but didn't react. Instead, she doubled down, speaking with calm precision. "If this is an official investigation, I'd like to know the nature of the suspicion. If not, then I have the right to be left alone." "Lady, we don't owe you an explanation," Collins barked. "You're acting suspicious just by talking the way you are." Gabrielle raised her chin slightly. "Being articulate is not grounds for detainment." "You're not in charge here," Collins snapped. Barrett finally stepped in. "Collins," he said, low, urgent, but Collins ignored him. "You're trying to play lawyer? Guess what? Out here, we're the law." Gabrielle's voice didn't waver. "That's not how the Constitution works." Collins's face turned a shade redder. "You want to keep pushing? You want to see how far this can go?" "I want to see if either of you remembers your oath," Gabrielle said. Barrett exhaled, audible and shaky. The surrounding crowd had grown quietly, instinctively. Travelers who had once been busy with phones and children were now standing still, watching. Gabrielle looked directly at Collins. "You've now threatened me verbally twice. You've refused to provide your badge number, and you've continued this engagement without probable cause or factual evidence of wrongdoing. Collins's voice rose. This ends now. I'm done playing your game. Barrett looked at him, eyes wide. Collins. Collins pointed a finger directly at Gabrielle's face. This isn't some debate. You don't get to walk away just because you memorized a few laws. Gabrielle stepped back half an inch, not in fear, but to remove herself from his space. Back off, she said with steel in her tone. Collins took that as defiance. You're resisting. No, Gabrielle answered. I'm reaching for my phone to record this for my safety. The movement was calm, telegraphed, open. Collins lunged. His hand grabbed her wrist before she could open the phone's camera. The contact was rough, fast, unnecessary. Gasps shot through the watching crowd. Gabrielle didn't fight back. She didn't scream. She locked eyes with him. You just escalated this to assault, she said. Barrett stepped forward, too late. Collins kept his grip tight. You're under investigation for interfering with police activity. I was answering questions, not interfering, Gabrielle said. Turn around. You don't have the authority, Gabrielle said. Yes, I do, Collins shouted. You don't have the authority, Gabrielle repeated. Yes, I do, Collins shouted again. The exchange repeated itself several times, growing more heated with each repetition. Finally, Barrett intervened. Collins, stand down. But it was too late. The moment Collins reached for his cuffs, cameras from every direction captured the scene. Multiple angles, live streams, witnesses. Barrett ran a hand over his face. Gabrielle stayed upright, her voice calm as ever. You're making a mistake that won't be forgotten. Collins didn't respond. The sound of the cuffs clicking open echoed like a gunshot across the gate. The cuffs clicked into place with a sharp, final snap. Officer Ryan Collins stood behind Gabrielle Mitchell, pulling her wrists tighter than necessary as he locked the steel bands around them. The cold metal dug into her skin, marking her not just physically but symbolically. It was the sound of power misused, the sound of control asserted by force instead of reason. Around them, the gate area erupted. What are you doing? Someone shouted. You can't do that. Another voice rang out from the line of passengers. Phones were raised instantly, red record icons blinking across multiple screens. Voices mixed, outrage, confusion, disbelief. People leaned over railings, stepped out of lines, watched from nearby gates. A woman yelled. She didn't even do anything. Gabrielle remained silent for a moment, her head held high even as Collins forced her arms behind her. She didn't resist. Her breathing was slow, measured. She glanced sideways at the growing crowd, then looked over her shoulder at Collins, her voice soft but unmissable. This won't end the way you think. Barrett stood off to the side, expression unreadable, eyes darting between Gabrielle, Collins, and the crowd. He could feel it. Something had shifted. The tone, the energy. This wasn't an ordinary incident anymore. Collins didn't seem to notice, or didn't care. He shoved Gabrielle forward. Let's move, he barked. Gabrielle stumbled slightly but regained her posture instantly. She walked forward on her own terms, refusing to be dragged. As they escorted her away from Gate B10, passengers parted to make space, but not in silence. The corridor filled with the buzz of protest. Phone cameras followed every movement. That's wrong, a man shouted. File a complaint, a woman said. Already posting live footage to social media. Barrett trailed behind, trying to ignore the rising tide of public reaction. He glanced up once. There were already airport staff talking into radios, motioning toward security cameras, whispering. Still, no one stopped them. Collins marched Gabrielle through the concourse, past coffee stands, baggage kiosks, and families frozen mid-step. A child asked, "Why is she in handcuffs?" No one had an answer. Gabrielle didn't speak during the walk. She counted her steps instead, noting the positions of every camera, reading the name tags of employees, clocking every directional sign, memorizing the path as though she were building a case in real time. To her, this wasn't an arrest, it was evidence collection. They reached the restricted zone entrance. An officer scanned a badge, and a door buzzed open. Gabrielle was led down a narrower corridor, plain walls, bright lights, tiled floors. Collins tightened his grip again. "Try anything, and you'll regret it." "I already do," Gabrielle said, her voice low, not in fear but in condemnation. No reply. They entered a small holding area, a stark room with a metal bench bolted to the wall, a stainless steel desk, and a half-asleep officer behind a glass window. A keypad beeped as Barrett entered a code. The internal precinct was quiet, sterile, and completely detached from the chaos outside. Gabrielle was guided to the center of the room. Collins removed the cuffs with a harsh twist. "Sit," he commanded. She adjusted her sleeves slowly, examining the red indentations on her wrists with clinical detachment. "Did you even check my ID before doing this?" she asked. Barrett looked away. Collins sneered. "You think you're special? I think you're in trouble," she said plainly. Barrett cleared his throat. "Let's get this over with. Book her for obstruction." Gabrielle turned to him. "On what basis? You interfered with a security investigation." "There was no investigation. There was an accusation. One you acted on without confirmation, without evidence, without protocol." "Enough," Collins snapped. Gabrielle finally sat on the bench, crossing her legs calmly. "You never asked who I was." "Not really." Collins scoffed. "We saw your ID. Doesn't make you exempt." "You looked at a name," she said. "But you didn't look." The door opened. A younger officer stepped in with a clipboard. "Do you want her processed now?" Collins nodded. Gabrielle didn't flinch. "What's your procedure for verifying detainee identity?" she asked. The officer paused, caught off guard. Barrett interjected. "She's already been identified." "No," Gabrielle said. "You confirmed a name, not an occupation, not a background check, not a status review." The room fell still for a beat. Gabrielle reached into her memory, pulling up the exact phrase from federal policy. Section 9.123 of TSA Law Enforcement Interaction Protocol requires officers to verify all identifying credentials if the subject is nonviolent and cooperative prior to escalation. Barrett said nothing. Collins laughed nervously. "Lady, you can recite all the legal codes you want. You're still in a holding room." Gabrielle stood. "And you're still unaware of who you just put cuffs on." The young officer with the clipboard glanced between them, now visibly confused. Gabrielle's voice was calm, steady, unmistakably authoritative. "You should have asked." The small processing room at the airport precinct was quiet save for the soft buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. The air was still, too sterile for the unnecessary arrest. Gabrielle Mitchell sat on the bench, back straight, eyes forward. Her wrists still bore faint red marks, and her calm presence was beginning to feel less like submission and more like strategy. She hadn't raised her voice once. She hadn't cursed. She hadn't resisted. And yet the silence she carried had begun to feel louder than the shouts from the gate. Across the room, Officer Collins paced in short, tight strides. Officer Barrett leaned on a desk, arms folded, staring at nothing. Neither man spoke to the other. Tension now hung between them, not against Gabrielle, but within themselves. Something about how she carried herself had unsettled them. The younger desk officer tapped at a keyboard, inputting basic information. "Full name?" he asked, not looking up. "Gabrielle Mitchell," she said. "Date of birth?" She answered without hesitation. The officer nodded slightly and kept typing. "Occupation?" Gabrielle didn't blink. She spoke clearly, calmly, as if announcing a courtroom verdict. "I am Chief Justice Gabrielle Mitchell, United States Court of Appeals." The typing stopped. The desk officer's hands froze mid-keystroke. His head turned toward her slowly. He blinked twice, processing what he had just heard. Barrett straightened slightly. Collins stopped pacing. The officer repeated, almost disbelieving. "Chief Justice." "Yes," Gabrielle said. "I am the Chief Justice of the Federal Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit." The silence that followed was immediate and absolute. Barrett's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His face paled. His jaw shifted slightly, but he was suddenly very still. Collins looked at her like she had just detonated a bomb in the room. "What did you say?" Gabrielle turned to him fully now. "You heard me." The younger officer at the desk stumbled for his mouse, then clicked into a federal database window. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. I just need to verify that." "You'll find it under the judicial appointment section," Gabrielle said. He nodded, too quickly, and began typing furiously. Barrett finally spoke, voice flat and hollow. "This is some kind of misunderstanding." Gabrielle's gaze didn't soften. "You've had multiple opportunities to ask the right questions. You made assumptions. You acted without cause. You escalated without reason." Collins took a step back, as if the distance might somehow fix what had just been broken. The desk officer's screen pinged once. His eyes scanned the result, then they widened. He turned the monitor slightly, just enough for Barrett to see. Gabrielle's federal profile filled the screen, a professional headshot, judicial seal, title, Chief Justice of the United States Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. Barrett stumbled back a step, his hand knocking over a stack of folders on the desk behind him. Collins's breath turned shallow. "No way." Gabrielle folded her hands in her lap. "Yes way." Nobody moved for a full 10 seconds. Barrett rubbed his forehead, suddenly drenched in sweat. "We did. You weren't." "You didn't ask," Gabrielle cut in. "You didn't check. You didn't pause long enough to treat me like a citizen, let alone a professional." The desk officer cleared his throat but said nothing. Collins looked like he'd swallowed gravel. This is bad." Gabrielle stood slowly, with purpose. Her voice never rose above conversation level. "You handcuffed a sitting federal judge based solely on the word of a single civilian and an unverified complaint." Barrett looked at the monitor again, as if hoping it would change. "You detained me without probable cause, denied me access to my phone, and failed to perform the basic verification required under TSA and federal engagement protocols." Collins opened his mouth again, but Gabrielle raised a finger. "You put your hands on me without justification," she said to him. "That alone constitutes assault under color of law." Collins took another step back. Barrett tried. "We can explain this." "No," Gabrielle replied. "You'll have the opportunity to explain to the authorities who now have jurisdiction over your actions." The words landed like steel. Gabrielle turned to the desk officer. "Please retrieve the number for the U.S. Marshals Service, Washington Field Office." He nodded immediately and picked up the landline phone on the desk. "I also need to speak with the Chief of Airport Security, the station supervisor, and the Federal Judiciary Security Liaison," she added. I'll call them now," the officer stammered. Gabrielle didn't sit again. She remained standing, her hands still calmly folded in front of her. Barrett looked like he might be sick. "Judge Mitchell, You can save the apologies for your statement," she said. Collins was now seated against the wall, staring at the floor. The phone on the desk rang. The officer picked it up, listened, then looked at Gabrielle. "It's the airport police chief," he said, barely above a whisper. "Good," Gabrielle said. "Tell him the Chief Justice would like to speak." Now Gabrielle Mitchell stood tall in the center of the processing room, no longer just a passenger, no longer just a detainee. Her voice was steady, her tone crisp, and every word carried the unmistakable cadence of judicial command. "First, remove the restraints from that bench," she said, nodding toward the set of unused cuffs still lying open near the wall, "and have them placed in an evidence bag." I want them logged with timestamp and chain of custody. The younger officer at the desk, still holding the receiver, froze, then he nodded quickly, scribbling notes on a notepad. Gabrielle didn't stop. Get me a transcript of the arrest record as written so far, unedited. That includes all previous incident reports, audio dispatch logs, and any internal communications referencing me by name or physical description. Barrett leaned against the desk, his face drained of color. Collins had retreated to the far corner of the room, jaw clenched but silent. She turned to them without raising her voice. Effective immediately, both of you are to cease verbal or physical interaction with me unless in the presence of your direct supervisor or legal counsel. Barrett opened his mouth, but she held up a single hand. Don't speak. Don't rationalize. Don't plead. The officer behind the desk handed her the receiver. Chief of Airport Police is on the line. Gabrielle took it with grace. This is Chief Justice Gabrielle Mitchell, she began. Yes, I am currently at your precinct, where I was unlawfully detained by 2 of your officers. I am invoking federal protocol for judicial breach. You are to report to this location in person immediately. Bring your deputy chief and legal counsel. She paused to listen, her expression unchanged. No explanation is acceptable over the phone. Bring your badge and ID. I will verify them myself. She hung up and handed the phone back without fanfare. Now connect me to the Washington field office of the U.S. Marshal Service, she said. The officer looked nervous but followed instructions, pressing buttons on the secure line. The room was silent except for the quiet clicks of the keypad. When the line connected, Gabrielle introduced herself again. This is Chief Justice Gabrielle Mitchell, badge verification code Alpha 741 Capital. I'm requesting immediate deployment of judicial protection personnel to Logan International Airport, code 6 level priority breach. Location: internal precinct. 2 airport officers in violation of Title 18, Section 242, and possibly Section 241. Another pause, then. Yes, I'll remain on site. I expect arrival within 20 minutes. She replaced the receiver gently. Barrett cleared his throat. Your Honor. Gabrielle turned toward him slowly. Did I grant permission to speak? Barrett looked down. Gabrielle glanced back at the officer at the desk. Now place a call to the Federal Judiciary Liaison Office. Use the emergency contact here. Inform them I've invoked Article 3 judicial protection under emergency status. Provide them with my court district and exact location. The young man's hands trembled slightly as he dialed, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. Gabrielle returned her attention to her wrists. I also want photographs of the marks on my wrists taken under proper evidence lighting. You will log them as part of an assault report per U.S. Marshal's procedure. She turned back to Collins. If either of you deletes or alters a single second of bodycam or security footage, I'll personally see to it that obstruction of justice is added to the list of charges. Collins didn't move. His mouth was tight, his stare burned into the floor. The room, once sterile and static, now pulsed with bureaucratic urgency. Phones rang. Officers whispered. Doors opened and closed with a frequency that suggested something much bigger was unfolding beyond the 4 walls. Gabrielle wasn't angry, she was efficient. Every instruction she gave was executed with judicial authority, rooted in federal law, backed by decades of courtroom experience, and enforced through layers of legal channels designed for exactly this type of emergency. A second officer entered with a clipboard. Ma'am, I'm here to document your injuries for the assault report. Gabrielle stepped aside, pulling back her sleeve. Red marks circled both wrists. The officer began photographing the evidence under proper lighting, zooming in on every abrasion. Once finished, Gabrielle nodded once. Thank you. Barrett, who had remained in the corner like a statue, finally spoke, voice cracking. We didn't know. We weren't told who you were. Gabrielle met his eyes. You didn't ask. There was no reply. The officer at the desk spoke into his handset again. "Yes, sir. She's still here." A pause. "Yes, confirmed, all secure." He looked at Gabrielle. "U.S. Marshals are inbound. ETA 12 minutes. Gabrielle nodded. "I'll speak with them first." She turned and walked toward the far side of the room, placing herself squarely between the two officers who had detained her and the desk where decisions were now being logged in real time. She said nothing else. She didn't need to. She had seized control of the room, not through intimidation but through expertise, through knowledge, through law. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't needed backup. She had used the very system they thought they controlled and turned it against them with surgical precision. The response was swift and overwhelming. Within an hour, Logan International Airport had become the center of a rapidly growing firestorm, not just inside the precinct but far beyond it. The ripple had become a wave. First came the black SUV. The U.S. Marshal Service arrived through a side entrance, bypassing public areas to avoid further disruption. Four agents, suited and expressionless, entered the precinct with quiet urgency. Their lead identified himself, showed his badge to the young officer at the desk, and requested immediate access to Chief Justice Gabrielle Mitchell. She stood as they approached. No introduction was needed. They already knew exactly who she was. "Chief Justice," the lead agent said, bowing his head slightly. "We're here to assume responsibility for your protection and initiate a federal inquiry." "Good," Gabrielle said. "You're going to need to secure every data source connected to this room. I want copies of all surveillance footage, body cams, audio feeds, and digital communications from the past 3 hours isolated, archived, and preserved under federal jurisdiction." "We've already started," the agent replied. A second group arrived minutes later, this time escorted by airport management. At the center was the airport police chief, flanked by the deputy chief and 2 legal advisors. Their expressions were grave. The moment he stepped into the room and saw Gabrielle, he froze. His mouth opened slightly, recognition dawning far too late. "Chief Justice Mitchell," he said. I had no idea." "Save it," she interrupted. "I've already provided a full preliminary statement. You'll receive it in writing along with a list of formal charges being submitted to the Department of Justice." The police chief's shoulders sank. Of course. Standing beside her now were not just marshals but officials from the Federal Judiciary's Security Division, staff who had flown in on an emergency transport flight from D.C. The courtroom wasn't in session, but justice was already being served. Gabrielle's voice remained composed as she turned to the officials. "The complaint originated at Gate B10. A civilian claimed to feel unsafe, offered no credible threat indicators, and misrepresented my behavior. The responding officers failed to verify her story, failed to review security footage, and failed to validate my identity despite proper documentation." She gestured toward a printed set of documents one of the marshals had retrieved from the precinct printer. "Here is the timeline of the incident, cross-referenced with airport CCTV and statements from bystanders. You'll find video from at least 3 passengers showing clear verbal aggression, wrongful detention, and physical contact without justification." A court liaison stepped forward with a sealed folder. "We've compiled verified transcripts from the gate agent, 3 travelers, and 1 airline employee. All corroborate the judge's account." The airport police chief swallowed hard. His legal counsel whispered something in his ear, but he waved it off. He turned to his 2 officers, Barrett and Collins, who stood stiff, pale, and silent in the corner. "Remove your weapons," he said. Neither man moved. "I said remove your weapons and your badges." Barrett unholstered his firearm first, then his badge. He placed them gently on the desk. Collins followed slowly, the sound of his gun hitting the desk loud in the otherwise quiet room. "You are suspended pending full investigation, effective immediately. You will not remain on these premises. You will leave under escort." 2 internal affairs officers stepped forward, collecting their gear. Neither Barrett nor Collins protested. There was nothing left to say. The chief turned back to Gabrielle. "I'll be issuing a formal apology on behalf of airport security within the hour." "Don't," she said flatly. "Save it for court." He nodded once, humiliated. Outside the room, news had already begun to spread. The first video hit social media just after Gabrielle had been escorted to the precinct, footage captured by a teenage passenger at Gate B10. Within minutes, it was on Twitter. By the time the marshals arrived, it had already surpassed 50,000 views. The caption read, "This woman got handcuffed in business class. Turns out she's a federal judge. Watch what happens." Cable news producers latched onto it instantly. Within an hour, Gabrielle's name trended nationally. Commentators argued over the implications: a federal judge, a wrongful arrest, a failure in protocol. Racial profiling, abuse of power. The footage spoke for itself: her calm voice, Collins's aggression, Barrett's smirks, the moment the cuffs were snapped on her wrists. Back inside the precinct, the marshals took over full evidence collection. Computers were accessed, drives copied, officer logs archived. Gabrielle reviewed every step, signing off on chain of custody forms and dictating redaction guidelines for any judicially privileged information. One of the marshals turned to her. "Would you like us to prepare the charges for referral to the U.S. Attorney's Office?" "Yes," Gabrielle said. "Start with civil rights violations under color of law." A liaison from the federal court system took notes beside her. "We'll also notify the Judicial Ethics Committee, in case any of this impacts public trust." "It already has," Gabrielle replied. "Now we respond accordingly." The police chief approached again, this time more cautiously. "If there's anything else we can do." "There is," Gabrielle said. "Locate the civilian who made the initial false report." The chief blinked. "The passenger?" Gabrielle turned her head slightly. "Yes, Elizabeth Whitley. I want her name officially logged, her statement preserved, and her boarding status verified." The chief's jaw tightened. "Understood. We'll track her immediately." Gabrielle returned to the table of evidence folders. "Make sure it's done. She won't walk away from this untouched." Elizabeth Whitley was halfway through a glass of complimentary champagne in her first-class seat when the flight attendant returned, smiling politely but with a stiffness that hadn't been there before. "Miss Whitley," the attendant said gently, "we've received a request from ground security. They'd like you to deplane briefly before departure." Elizabeth blinked. "Excuse me. There's a matter that needs clarification," the attendant continued. "They said it won't take long." Passengers nearby turned to glance. Elizabeth straightened in her seat. "What kind of matter?" "I'm not sure, ma'am, but I was asked to inform you it's mandatory." Elizabeth hesitated for a second too long, then, clutching her handbag, she stood. "Fine, but this had better be quick." She followed the attendant down the aisle, past rows of curious eyes. At the aircraft door, two plainclothes security agents waited on the jet bridge. One of them flashed a badge. "Elizabeth Whitley?" he asked. "Yes. We're with Airport Security Investigations. Please come with us." "What is this about?" "We'll explain at the security office." She huffed but complied. The champagne buzz in her head dulled fast, her steps growing heavier with each stride. In a private conference room just beyond the terminal, she was seated, handed a bottle of water, and left to wait. A digital clock ticked on the wall. Her fingers drummed against her bag. Something felt wrong, off, bigger than she had expected. A door opened. A federal officer stepped inside with two folders and a laptop. He sat down, opened the top file, and looked at her. "Miss Whitley, I'm Investigator Daniels with the U.S. Department of Justice. You are currently under preliminary review for submitting a false report to airport authorities that contributed to the wrongful detention of a federal official." Elizabeth blinked. "What?" "Specifically, a false and racially biased claim made at Gate B10, resulting in the arrest of Chief Justice Gabrielle Mitchell." The room tilted. Elizabeth gripped the sides of her chair. Chief who? Gabrielle Mitchell, Daniels repeated. Chief Justice of the United States Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. The woman you accused of acting suspiciously. I didn't. Elizabeth started, then stopped. Daniels opened the laptop. On the screen was a paused frame of her pointing directly at Gabrielle. The timestamp and gate information were clear. This was recorded by the gate surveillance system. We also have audio from the gate agent and 3 passenger cell phone recordings. Elizabeth stared at the screen, mouth dry. Daniels pressed play. Her voice came through, crisp and unmistakable. She doesn't belong here. Check her papers. The playback stopped. Elizabeth swallowed hard. Daniels continued. We are also reviewing the situation under the lens of 18 U.S. Code Section 1001, false statements within jurisdiction of the federal government, and 42 U.S. Code Section 1985, conspiracy to interfere with civil rights. This is insane, Elizabeth muttered. I didn't conspire with anyone. You knowingly filed a baseless accusation, Daniels said calmly. That accusation triggered an incident that's now under federal investigation. The 2 officers involved have already been suspended. You are the origin point of this event. Elizabeth began to panic. I didn't know who she was. I was just uncomfortable. That's not illegal. It's not illegal to feel uncomfortable, Daniels replied. It's illegal to weaponize that discomfort against someone without evidence, especially when it results in abuse of authority. I didn't tell them to arrest her. No, Daniels said. But you created the opportunity. And you did it by suggesting she didn't belong. Elizabeth's voice turned pleading. This is a misunderstanding. Daniels placed a legal document in front of her. You're being issued a formal notice of inquiry. You'll be expected to appear for a recorded interview and may face civil and criminal liability pending the results of our investigation. Her eyes scanned the paper, legal terms blurring into each other. If you wish to cooperate, Daniels said, you can begin by signing that notice and submitting a sworn statement. It will be reviewed before any formal charges are filed. Elizabeth didn't move. Ma'am, this is your chance to show that you're willing to take responsibility, Daniels added. After several long seconds, she picked up the pen and signed. Daniels stood. We'll contact you soon. You're free to leave the airport for now, but I recommend you speak with legal counsel. She nodded, speechless. The door shut behind him. Elizabeth sat alone, shaking. By the time she returned to the main terminal, her flight had departed, but that was the least of her problems. Later that evening, her name hit the news cycle, not front and center yet, but embedded in. The investigative reports now being circulated by legal analysts. The woman who triggered the encounter, the one whose complaint had no basis. Social media lit up. Some headlines asked, "Who is Elizabeth Whitley?" Others said, "Passenger behind false complaint under federal scrutiny." Photos surfaced. Her social profiles were locked down within hours, but screenshots had already spread. The court of public opinion was assembling, and for once, Elizabeth was the one being judged. The federal charges came faster than most expected. Just 72 hours after the incident at Logan International, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Massachusetts filed formal criminal indictments against former officers James Barrett and Ryan Collins. Their suspensions were upgraded to terminations. Their access to police systems, weapons, and precinct facilities was revoked. Their legal status had shifted, no longer enforcers of the law, but defendants standing against it. The charges were steep, serious, and unflinching. Count 1, deprivation of rights under color of law, 18 U.S. Code Section 242. Count 2, false arrest and unlawful detention. Count 3, excessive use of force. Count 4, conspiracy to violate civil rights, 42 U.S. Code Section 1985. Barrett was charged on all counts. Collins faced additional charges due to his direct physical involvement in the unlawful handcuffing. The indictment documents were made public by noon. Legal analysts flooded the airwaves. Clips of the arrest circulated in split screen alongside screenshots of the federal filings. News anchors used phrases like textbook abuse of authority and failure of procedural oversight. But the evidence did most of the talking. The officer's own body cam footage left no room for interpretation. Collins's tone, Barrett's silence, the refusal to follow standard procedure, Gabrielle's voice clear, lawful, composed, contrasted with the condescending and threatening behavior of the officers. Airport security camera angles further validated her timeline, showing the moment of approach, the baseless questioning, and the exact instant Collins slapped the cuffs on her wrists. The videos even captured bystanders reacting, gasping, and filming with their own phones. And then there were the live streams. 2 separate travelers had uploaded videos to Instagram and TikTok, unedited, unfiltered, real-time. One was angled directly at Gabrielle's calm demeanor, while Collins shouted in her face. The other showed the crowd yelling in protest as she was led away. Combined, the footage had amassed over 15 million views by the time the indictment was filed. The DOJ's Civil Rights Division issued a statement. The Department of Justice will not tolerate law enforcement actions that violate constitutional protections. Public officials are bound to the highest standards of conduct, especially when armed with the authority to detain and arrest. In this case, clear evidence supports a criminal violation of those responsibilities. Neither Barrett nor Collins made public statements. Their legal teams, however, moved quickly to request separate trials. Barrett's attorney pushed for a plea deal, citing his client's failure to intervene rather than direct involvement. Collins's lawyer, in contrast, attempted to reframe the entire event as a tense misunderstanding that had escalated beyond control. The judge overseeing the arraignment denied bail initially, then granted conditional release under strict monitoring, including surrender of passports, daily check-ins, and no-contact orders involving the federal judiciary. Public reaction was immediate and intense. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, holding signs, "Silence is not safety. Cuffs for her equals prison for them. Power doesn't excuse prejudice." Civil rights organizations filed amicus briefs urging maximum penalties. Law students and bar associations issued open letters supporting the prosecution. Law professors across the country added the case to syllabi overnight. In police departments nationwide, emails circulated with attached clips and cautionary memos. This is what happens when protocol is ignored. The legal implications stretched beyond the courtroom. Mayors, police chiefs, and city attorneys began re-examining their own local use of force guidelines. Several jurisdictions accelerated long-stalled body cam review policies. Training academies requested new modules on unconscious bias, civil liberty protections, and escalation control. The dominoes had started to fall. Inside the legal community, the indictment triggered a more personal reckoning. Judges, both state and federal, watched the footage not as bystanders but with the uneasy awareness that it could have been any of them. Courtroom authority had not protected Gabrielle in that terminal. A robe didn't matter when the badge misread the person. Still, the criminal prosecution had one major hurdle ahead: a federal trial. The U.S. District Court scheduled pre-trial hearings within 3 weeks. The courtroom would be open to media, with limited seating for the public. The government would present evidence first. Witnesses would include airport personnel, passengers, and digital forensics experts. But the most anticipated testimony wouldn't come from a staffer. It would come from the woman in the gray blazer who'd said only one thing as the cuffs snapped around her wrists: "This won't end the way you think." The courtroom was packed. It wasn't the kind of trial that came and went quietly. The proceedings were federal, the charges severe, and the eyes of the nation firmly fixed on what had started as a simple security call and erupted into a constitutional reckoning. Chief Justice Gabrielle Mitchell entered through a side hallway under U.S. Marshal escort. Though she was not there as a judge today, the entire room instinctively straightened as she walked in. Her composure remained intact. Her face gave nothing away. The prosecution called her first. "Chief Justice Mitchell, please take the stand." She stepped up and placed her hand on the Bible without hesitation. Sworn in, seated and ready, she scanned the room once, meeting the gaze of no one in particular but ensuring no one would forget what they were about to hear. The lead prosecutor approached. "Your Honor, can you recount in your own words what occurred on the afternoon of May 5th at Logan International Airport?" Gabrielle nodded once. "Yes." She began without theatrics, no dramatization, just facts articulated with the clarity of someone who knew precisely how a courtroom functioned and what it demanded. She described the boarding area, her position in line, the approach of the officers, the nature of their questioning, and her calm attempts to assert her legal rights. The jury listened in silence. The prosecution introduced evidence, Exhibit 7A, airport gate surveillance footage. The courtroom lights dimmed. A large screen blinked to life, showing Gabrielle standing at the front of the business class line, reviewing documents on her tablet. The video played silently, but the stillness in the room made it feel louder than any sound. The footage showed officers Barrett and Collins approaching. It showed Gabrielle stepping aside. It showed Collins gesturing aggressively, Gabrielle's calm expression, the snap of the cuffs, the shift in passenger body language, the phones rising, the protest. When the footage ended, no one spoke for several seconds. Then came the body cam video. The footage was darker, more intimate. Voices were clear. "I'm exercising my rights. You think you're clever. Remove your phone. You'll regret this." Collins's tone filled the courtroom, sharp, escalating, laced with contempt. The camera caught the angle of his hand on her arm, the cuffs, the pressure. Collins, seated at the defense table, dropped his head. His shoulders tensed. He rubbed his palms together and avoided looking at the screen. Barrett didn't move at all. The prosecution continued. Exhibit 12B, live stream footage from passenger cell phone. The angle shifted, more chaotic, handheld. Gabrielle in profile, Collins's voice still present, Barrett's silence, his refusal to intervene. Background voices, "She didn't do anything," and "This is wrong." The jury was motionless. When the final clip ended, the lights came back up. Gabrielle looked directly at the prosecutor. "What I experienced was not a misunderstanding. It was targeted, unjustified, and avoidable. If I had not held the position I do, I'd have been forgotten by now. But I am here not just for myself, I'm here because millions of others wouldn't get this chance." The defense declined to cross-examine. Collins sat slumped, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. His face was wet. He wiped at his eyes but didn't lift his head. Barrett sat upright but rigid, staring at the edge of the defense table as though he were trying to will it to disappear. The judge adjourned for the day. As Gabrielle stepped down, the courtroom remained silent. Her heels clicked softly against the polished floor as she exited, every step steady, measured, final. The final day of the trial drew the largest crowd yet. By now, the courthouse had become a public stage for a case that had captured national attention. Every news outlet had a correspondent stationed outside, every camera pointed toward the double doors where justice would soon be announced, not for the powerful, but for those who had once held power and used it recklessly. Inside the courtroom, every seat was filled. The jury had reached a verdict the evening before. Now all that remained was for it to be read aloud and entered into history. Judge Karen Roth, a respected federal judge with over 2 decades on the bench, presided over the case. She entered in silence, robes sweeping, eyes steady. "All rise," the bailiff announced. The room stood. "You may be seated." Judge Roth looked directly at the jury foreman. "Has the jury reached a unanimous verdict?" "Yes, Your Honor," the foreman said. A folded paper was handed over. Roth opened it and read silently for a few seconds. Then with no hesitation, she spoke. "In the matter of United States versus Barrett and Collins, on the charge of deprivation of rights under color of law, the jury finds the defendants guilty." Neither defendant moved. "On the charge of unlawful detention, guilty. On the charge of excessive use of force, guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to violate civil rights, guilty." A collective hush fell over the courtroom. No cheers, no gasps, just the quiet weight of consequences finally landing. Collins lowered his head again, staring into his lap. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, but he didn't respond. Barrett looked forward, jaw tight, his expression unreadable. Judge Roth turned to the bench, pulled a second folder from beneath her case notes, and opened it. "These are serious convictions," she said, "and while this court recognizes that neither defendant had prior criminal records, the nature of these offenses, committed while in uniform, demands accountability without leniency." She looked at each man individually. "You, Officer Collins, used your position not to protect but to intimidate. You escalated a peaceful situation into violence and humiliation. You ignored your duty, and you betrayed your oath." Collins didn't look up. "You, Officer Barrett, allowed it to happen. You stood in silence while a colleague violated protocol, civil rights, and basic decency. Inaction can be just as damning as aggression, and in this case, it was." Barrett blinked slowly but remained silent. Judge Roth closed the folder. "For these reasons, and considering the impact of your actions on a federal official, public trust in law enforcement, and the safety of those disproportionately affected by racial profiling, this court sentences you both to 4 years in federal prison." A murmur rippled through the gallery. 4 years each, she repeated, "without parole, effective immediately." The bailiff stepped forward. Judge Roth turned to the courtroom audience and the cameras that would soon echo her words to millions. "This country will not tolerate racism hiding in uniform." Then she stood and exited the bench. The room remained still. Bailiffs handcuffed both men without resistance. Collins's face was red, his eyes glassy, but he didn't speak. Barrett didn't react at all. The fall from authority to inmate was swift and silent. As the 2 former officers were led from the courtroom, Chief Justice Gabrielle Mitchell, seated in the second row with her arms folded, didn't move. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She only watched. Outside, press scrambled to report the sentencing in real time. Across the country, headlines broke within minutes. "Guilty, officers sentenced in Judge Mitchell Airport arrest. Justice for the Chief Justice. Federal verdict sends strong message. System bends but doesn't break. 2 officers jailed for racially motivated abuse." In law schools, the case was already being studied. In police academies, it was being added to training. In newsrooms, it became a symbol of accountability, of the law's reach, of the moment when a badge no longer protected those who misused it. The Mitchell case was now part of national legal history. But the story wasn't finished yet. Elizabeth Whitley had built her public image over 3 decades. She was a prominent figure on several corporate boards, a regular at charity galas, and a frequent donor to political campaigns. Her name had appeared in annual lists of women of influence, and she had even been honored with a regional award for philanthropy just 6 months earlier. But none of that mattered now. The civil lawsuit filed by Chief Justice Gabrielle Mitchell against Elizabeth moved quickly. It wasn't just a complaint, it was a full-scale legal assault. The charges: defamation, malicious reporting, false public statements, and civil conspiracy. The documents were served to Elizabeth's legal counsel within 10 days of the criminal trial's conclusion. Her attorneys immediately began negotiating. They knew the evidence was insurmountable: surveillance footage, audio recordings, sworn witness statements, all pointed to one truth: Elizabeth had instigated an unjustifiable situation with racially charged intent. Going to trial would mean exposing her conduct to the public record in minute, excruciating detail. The risk was unacceptable. After 2 rounds of confidential settlement talks, Elizabeth agreed to a deal. She would pay $450,000 in damages to Gabrielle Mitchell and issue a written acknowledgement of responsibility to be published through legal channels and entered into the official court record. No cameras, no jury, no televised admission of guilt. It wasn't an apology, but it was submission. Gabrielle signed off on the settlement. Elizabeth's reputation, however, did not survive. The terms of the agreement didn't bar public reporting. The moment court filings became accessible, major outlets picked them up. Her name appeared in headlines nationwide, Woman behind false claim pays the price. Elizabeth Whitley reaches settlement in civil suit with federal judge, $450,000 the cost of a lie. In the span of 2 weeks, she was removed from the board of Whitley and Brooks, a real estate conglomerate co-founded by her late husband. The press release cited recent events incompatible with the company's core values. Within days, the charities followed suit. Her name vanished from the leadership page of the Urban Literacy Foundation. An annual arts gala replaced her on its honorary chair list. A scholarship fund she had personally funded for over a decade quietly ended its association. The message was consistent: she was no longer welcome. Behind closed doors, Elizabeth's legal team tried to contain the damage. They advised her to go offline, restrict access to her social media, and decline all interviews. A public statement would only make it worse. Her family distanced themselves, especially her adult children, 2 of whom held positions in public-facing industries. At home, Elizabeth found herself alone in a house that once hosted lavish dinners and fundraiser receptions. The silence was heavy. Her inbox overflowed not with invitations but cancellations. The world she'd spent a lifetime curating had collapsed. She considered leaving the country briefly, but even that seemed futile. A former colleague attempted to defend her in an online op-ed, claiming, "We shouldn't destroy someone's life over a single mistake." The backlash was immediate. Comments flooded in, calling out the minimization of racism, the privilege in play, and the harm done to countless people whose lives weren't protected by judicial titles. No other publication accepted op-eds on her behalf after that. The settlement didn't include non-disparagement clauses. Gabrielle hadn't asked for silence, only accountability. And the consequences rippled beyond Elizabeth herself. Corporate boardrooms discussed. Internal bias screening processes. Conferences on legal ethics added new sessions about the role of civilian complaints in misuse of law enforcement. Diversity workshops cited the Mitchell case by name. Elizabeth's actions became a cautionary tale across multiple industries. Law firms used her name as shorthand for liability. "Don't pull an Elizabeth," one compliance director was heard saying during a training. In the span of 4 months, Elizabeth went from respected elite to living case study. At one point, she wrote a private letter to Gabrielle through her attorneys, expressing regret for the unintended harm. The letter never received a reply. Gabrielle had no need for personal closure. The record spoke for itself. And for Elizabeth, there was no escape from the verdict rendered by society, even if no judge had delivered it in open court. The case of Chief Justice Gabrielle Mitchell didn't just end with convictions and settlements, it cracked open a national conversation that institutions could no longer avoid. Within weeks of the trial's conclusion, members of Congress began calling for formal reviews of airport security procedures. What had once been seen as standard discretion was now under a harsh spotlight, illuminating deep flaws in how authority was exercised and who it was exercised against. The Department of Justice moved first. A memorandum was issued to all federally funded law enforcement agencies, requiring immediate review of passenger screening and response protocols in public transportation hubs. Within 30 days, every major airport in the country was ordered to submit documentation on how passenger complaints were received, assessed, and escalated. Simultaneously, the DOJ rolled out a new policy directive: mandatory body-worn camera activation for all airport-based officers during passenger interactions. The footage would be encrypted and uploaded to a federal database for quarterly audits. The order came with sharp language: failure to document interactions undermines public trust and increases liability. All officers are expected to conduct their duties with transparency, accountability, and procedural fairness. Training requirements were overhauled next. The Federal Law Enforcement Training Centers, FLETC, implemented a comprehensive anti-bias curriculum, including situational exercises based on the Mitchell incident. Officers would now be required to complete annual certifications in de-escalation, civil rights awareness, and implicit bias recognition. The program wasn't optional, it became a prerequisite for assignment to any federal transit facility. Airports responded quickly. Signage changed. Protocols changed. Gate agents received new scripts for addressing passenger concerns, now with an emphasis on verifying threats before contacting law enforcement. Even the Transportation Security Administration issued an